Well, that song we just sang, it's a great lead into not only today, but for the next few weeks as we do something a little bit different here. If you've been around an Adventist church before, you know we do this thing called communion, a celebration of the Lord's Supper. How many times a year? I'm going to help you out, all right? 4. But that's kind of traditionally 4. And do you know why we do it 4 times a year? You're exactly right. Nobody knows why we do it 4 times a year. Honestly, we don't. Actually, the people that started our church back 150, 160, 170 years ago, a long time ago, when they had come out of different churches to start this church, and they said, some of them came from churches that celebrated this every weekend. And some of them came out of churches that only celebrated it once a year, and some came out of it 4 times a year, and they had this long discussion that, once a year seems like it's just too sporadic, too far off to stop and remember what this is all about. This overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God that chases us down, that knocks down things, that is always pursuing us. And if we wait once a year, it's not enough to remind us of that. But if we do it every week, there is this chance that it just becomes so regular that we forget the power of it. And so, in their wisdom, they decided on 4 times a year. And it's worked for us for a long time, but sometimes I think it's important for us to stop for a moment and to maybe focus a little stronger on it. Because the reality in your life is just much like my life, and that is that God has always been present there. And if you've been around, I've told you my story before. I was not raised in a Christian home. I was not raised as anything. I was nothing. But even in my nothingness, in my time of not knowing God, not thinking too much about God, God was still there. And for those of you in this space today, and those of you watching online all over the world, all of our dots, all these different places, you've probably had the exact same experience. Maybe as you look back, you see God there, and God there, and God there, and for whatever reason, at some point, those words and those thoughts begin to stick. And you're reminded, even today, even this last week, God was present. That God was working in your life to try to knock down those barriers that are between us, because let's be honest, all of us have barriers that we put up between God, right? We knock them down, and we build them back up again. We knock them down, build them up again, and some have barriers that are so hidden that we don't really want to go there, but those are things that impact our relationship with God. And so we're going to look at the next few weeks together. We're going to come and we're going to celebrate communion. This week upstairs we had this chance to do feet washing. That's a thing we do around here, and it's because Jesus did it. In fact, we're going to look at the story that we get that whole practice from. But it's really more about washing feet, because that doesn't work today for us as much as it did back then. Most of you wear shoes and socks. Most of you take a bath more than once every 6 months, and we are thankful, so thankful for that, right? But it's really about putting ourselves in a place of serving somebody else and allowing somebody else to serve us. In fact, Jesus will say it's all tied into this experience of salvation. That once we become his follower, there are still those moments in our life when we need to wash the dirt off our feet. That your life and my life have gone down different roads since the last time we did this, and stuff gets collected, and we just need to get it off to remind ourselves that God is always trying to wash us away from those things. That he comes into our life, and it's about just following him and our lives changing. But there's times to kind of clean it up, but it's not a time to tear it all back down. It's just to clean those things. And so today we're going to go back to one of the stories that one of the guys who was there when Jesus was here, and what he wrote about it. It's a part of your Bible that's called the Gospels. We have 4 parts. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2 of them are written by guys who were actually there, or authored by guys who were actually there, John and Matthew. John and, great crowd today, John and Matthew. Mark, most people consider Mark was sort of a mentee of Peter, and so Peter, that's kind of Peter's story of what he remembers about Jesus, but he tells it to Mark writes it down. Then a guy named Luke comes along much later, and he begins to gather information. He's kind of the reporter, right? The investigative reporter. He gets all this stuff, and he writes that. And so what we have in each of those 4 different, what we call Gospels, those 4 different pictures into the life of Jesus, are times some very different stories. And for me, that's not a thing that knocks the Bible. That's actually, for me, a thing that proves its reliability. Because you know you've been someplace when you thought something was a certain way and somebody else was convinced that it was something else, right? You've been to a party and somebody said, your wife says to you, oh, I know so-and-so was there. And you're like, they were not there. I was at that party. I did not see them. And the answer to whether that person was there or not is, your wife's right, guys. That's the answer, right? She's going to help you out a little, right? But it's true, right? I mean, there are pieces and things that sometimes eyewitnesses aren't always the most reliable because we always just see certain things. We don't always get the right pictures. And so we're going to look at the story and kind of look at some of those differences, the things that add to it and the things that remind us again of this overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God that I hope that you have seen evidenced in your life this week. But before we get there, I invite you to bow your heads and let's pray another time today, all right? Lord, as we've sang those words just a couple of minutes ago, that word reckless sticks out, and for some of us, it's a word that just scares us. Because if we're honest, it just sounds too reckless. It sounds too much out there, and we like a little more controlled setting, a little more practical, a little more consistent. But I'm thankful today that though you are always the same, that sameness is not always the same consistency. That you work in each of our lives in a way that works for each of our lives. That you meet each of us in just the place we need you to meet us. And for the person in this room and in this space today that is maybe thinking about that or isn't quite sure about that, just finds himself here today, I pray that again you would continue to show up in their lives. Continue to tear down those things. Continue to climb after them. For those of us that have been followers for a while, it's good to be reminded again of your reckless love, not just when we found you, and you found us, but even today. So today as we celebrate, Jesus, what you did for us, what you did for each and every one of us, may again we experience your recklessness. And may we be thankful for it today. In your name, amen. All right, the story we're going to pick up is actually over in Matthew 26. It's a little before the story. Matthew's one of the guys who was actually there, and he tells of a story that happens 2 days before Jesus has this experience in what they do Passover, and then it leads to a whole crazy sort of events that he goes out, and he gets arrested, and ultimately gets convicted and crucified, what all Easter is all about. But 2 days before that, Jesus is at a place having this great meal with a guy named Simon the leper. Now, we don't know if Simon is a guy who was a leper, had leprosy and was healed by Jesus, or whether that was, he had some kind of skin condition that was healed some other way. But, I mean, let's be honest. Simon the leper would be a terrible nickname, right? I mean, especially if you've already been healed of this thing. It'd be like somebody, those of you that have had cancer, somebody saying, hey, this is Mike, the cancer patient, It's like, really, it's been 10 years, I'm no longer that, but it sticks. And that's how people knew him. Simon the leper, even though he was apparently not a leper anymore because you couldn't be around them if he was. And so Jesus is at this guy's house, and there's a bunch of important people there. And in the midst of that, in Matthew's version of it, he says that this woman approaches him, that is Jesus, with this alabaster jar, and it's filled with expensive perfume. One of the other guys, as they remember the story, says that pint jar of perfume was so expensive that it was literally a year's salary's worth of stuff. Now, I don't know how much you make, but I want you to think about that whole year's salary. That's how much that stuff cost. And this is what she brings to this gathering, this party, this celebration, whatever was going on. And Matthew tells us that she pours this. In fact, some of the other guys tell us he actually has to break it because that's how these things were sealed. They had to be sealed, and you had to break them open. So you broke it, it was open, you were going to use it. And she begins to pour this perfume on Jesus' head while he was eating. To which I don't know about you, but I read the story and I think, ew, right? I mean, I'm eating, and we have to imagine it's a pretty good meal because Jesus was a celebrity by now, and I'm sure Simon the leper, who is just tired of that nickname, is trying to put on a good meal and has brought his best food, and Jesus is eating it, and all of a sudden this oil gets poured in his head and it's pouring down his hair, and another one of the guys will say she pours it on his feet, and she's wiping all over, and the smell gets every place. And his followers, disciples, were upset when they saw what this woman did. Now, one of the guys who were there will say it was Judas who's the one that spoke up. But I'm appreciative that at least two of the other people who record the story tell us it wasn't just Judas, it was a number of the boys. And they are upset because, as they remember it, why this waste? Any of you ever spend money on something that later you thought was really dumb to spend money on? Don't raise your hand. Don't elbow anybody, but just think, right? Give me a nice little nod, right? You know, and you look back and think, what a waste, right? What I could have done with that money, right? And that's where the disciples are at this moment. However many jumped in here, you know, they join that. And it's a reminder again of how powerful criticism is to pull us in. And how susceptible we all are to it. And when something happens that's a little bit off and we're not quite sure about, and somebody says something, we all kind of join in and get mad, we get indignant, we get angry. How can you waste that? Why would you spend that money on that? Not only why waste it, it could have been sold for a lot of money, a great deal of money, and the money could have been given to the poor, right? Now, it may have been an actual piece that they were really sincere about this. I'm guessing some of them were mad because they were sincere about it. Some of them were told Judas was kind of playing loose with the money, and so maybe it was really, that's just a cover. But whatever the case is, some of the guys are upset. And apparently, they start to berate this woman. What a waste. How could you do that? What are you thinking? Why would you buy that stuff and then pour it on him and then lose it all in this one moment? To which Matthew says, knowing what had happened, Jesus says to the guys, why are you troubling, that is bothering, criticizing this woman? I love when Jesus speaks up. Because Jesus is saying, guys, you don't have a problem with her. You have a problem with you, and you have a problem with me. Because you see it as a waste, which tells me how you guys are looking at this whole thing, which tells me you have a little bit of issue with how I do things. You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. And Jesus, with that one statement, changes the whole dynamic. Because this is no longer about wasting perfume. He's reminding that, you know, you can always use money. You can always help. There will always be these poor people to help. There will always be this need, always this thing that I want you to do. But I'm not always going to be here. And this woman has poured perfume on my body, and she's done it to prepare for my burial. Which kind of sucks the whole air out of the room, doesn't it? Because everybody has to think, oh man, he's talking that dying stuff again, and we've been over this the last few weeks especially, and we're telling him to calm down. We've come to Jerusalem. We know it's kind of scary here, but we don't see this happening. He's too important. And that's important to know because what happens right after this? But before that, or actually right after, then one of the 12, that is Judas Iscariot, he went to talk to the leading chief priest. Every writer, as they remember the story, says that as soon as this meeting got done with this Simon the leper's house, that Judas goes and meets with the chief priest. It's almost like it's linked together, that this has reached the level for him. This is the last straw. He's ready to cut his losses. He's gotten to this place where he just can't handle the way Jesus is doing things. So he goes to the chief priest, and Matthew says that what he asked him is, what will you pay? What will you give me for giving, that is the train that is delivering Jesus to you? To which when we sit here looking back on that event, we think, how in the world could Judas do this, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons that you have probably never met anybody in your life whose given name was Judas. But here's the reality. Let's be honest. We are not always so great. And even sometimes in our rightness, we have been wrong because Judas was right. That was expensive perfume. He was right in his facts. It was a waste to pour it out on Jesus because, well, it got on him and it made the place smell great and it was probably going to stick with him. That smell was probably, Jesus could still smell when he hung on that cross, which is amazing. But in a practical sense, it was a waste. And in his rightness, he was wrong. And I'm guessing most of us at some point have betrayed somebody important in our lives. Sometimes unintentionally, we didn't mean to. We told our kids, yeah, we're going to be there, but life got crazy. We had this happen. We had that happen. We have all the excuses, and they're all right, but in that moment, that rightness doesn't make it right. And I also imagine there are some of us who, like Judas, were intentional in our betraying. We knew what we were doing. We knew what was motivating us to do that. And we were still willing to do it. And we need to own up to that. We need to own up that there's a little Judas in all of us. We don't need to see ourselves as Jesus in this picture because, let's be honest, none of us is like Jesus in this picture. See, when we take control from God, we become responsible for the outcome. There's this underlying theme that runs through a lot of the Bible stories, and it's simply this, that when we follow God, when God says do this, when we do what he's asked us to do, he takes responsibility for it. Whether it looks like it works out or not, he's responsible for it. When we take control, then we own all the things that happen to us. Which leads us to 2 days later, Jesus and the guys are in this room. They're preparing to have Passover, which is a very important feast for them as Jews, but Jesus would use this moment to change the whole dynamic of what that message was about. But John will tell us that he's gotten in this room, that the guys have sat down, they begin the Passover feast, they're going through the whole Seder ceremony, they're repeating this stuff, they're reminding themselves of the meaningfulness of how God worked through Moses to free their people. And at some point during the meal, John says that Jesus stands up, and he takes off his outer clothing, and what he's mentioning there is this robe that Jesus wore as a rabbi to signify that. They had these rabbi jackets. He takes that off to signify that he's laying that aside. And he takes a towel and he wraps it around his waist. And he pours water into a bowl and begins to wash the followers, the disciples' feet. And I want you to notice something. And as I read that, not to forget, there were how many disciples? 12 disciples, which means he washed how many disciples' feet? Which means Judas's feet got washed by Jesus. Which is important to know as this whole story unfolds, as the night goes on. Because Jesus does this and he washes all their feet. And if you remember the story, I'm not going to go into it, you can read it for yourself, but Peter says, oh, no, you're not washing my feet. Which Jesus says, oh, yes, I am. Well, actually, he doesn't quite say that. He says, if I don't, then you're not part of me. And of course, he gets all like, oh, don't do it, Throw water on all of me, Jesus. And yes, they calm down, Peter. But Jesus has done this, right? He's washed each and every disciple's feet. And if you've ever washed somebody else's feet, you know that there's something about kneeling there and washing their feet and how you feel in the moment. But if you're having somebody wash your feet, how you feel in the moment as well, right? Feel uncomfortable. And to have Jesus wash your feet and look up at you, with the smell of the perfume still wafting around because he's got it all poured all over his head. I have to wonder how in that moment, not just Judas, but all the disciples felt. And then Jesus would go on and talk about how important this is. And then he comes back. And as he gets done, he says to Peter, he says, after a person has had a bath, wash the bodies clean. He needs only to wash his feet. And you men are clean, which is a great statement, right? But not all of you. And it's one of those moments that maybe you've had. Maybe you had it when you've gone to the principal's office and you're not sure. One of those moments that you're not sure why you went to the principal's office. Not the moment you knew exactly why, right? Or maybe you get called into not just your boss's office, but the big boss's office. And you're thinking to yourself, because I don't know what I did, but I must have done something. For some of us, it's like getting pulled over to a police officer and you're thinking, I have no idea what I did wrong, but I must have done. There's this guilt that just right away floods into us that I must have done something to get it. I'm saying for some of us, because some of you, there's a whole other reason, but in that moment, we've all had them. When we feel guilty for no reason other than it's the moment. When Jesus says these words, but not all of you, it impacts the room. In fact, John will tell us that Jesus knew who would turn against him and betray him. That Jesus was already clear on what was happening before this night. That means that Jesus knew before he washed their feet. Jesus knew that before he ate the meal. Jesus knew that as they were making the last little bit of a trip to Jerusalem. He knew that one of these guys was going to betray him. So John says, after Jesus has said these things, he gets very troubled. And if you've ever been on the betrayed end of things, you know how troubling it is. Because our question always in that moment is, how could they do that, right? How could they? How could he? How could she do that? And how could they do that to me? So Jesus is troubled, and he says openly, I tell you the truth, one of you will turn against and betray me. Which seems like Jesus is getting clearer and clearer about this, right? He said already, not all of you are clean, and everybody looks at each other like, Now he says, one of you is going to betray me. And he says they begin to look at each other because they didn't know who Jesus was talking about. And you know how we look at each other, right? We look at each other like, is it you? And we also look at each other like, hope they're not looking at me. I mean, isn't that the worst feeling to have? When you feel guilty you don't know why you feel guilty, but you just feel guilty because you're afraid something might get found out. You have no idea what it is, but it's in that moment. And so all the guys are looking at each other, and Jesus talking, and finally one of them says, hey to John. John asked him. So John asked Jesus, Lord, who is it? To which Jesus says, I'm going to dip this piece of bread into the dish. And the man I give it to is the man who will turn against that is betray me. To which, if you heard Jesus say that, what would you be doing at this moment? You want to know who he gives the bread to, right? John says he was there next to Jesus. Jesus takes the piece of bread, he dips it, and he gives it to Judas, which you expect everybody at the moment to jump up and yell at Judas, right? And Jesus looks at Judas because nobody jumps up. Because Jesus, though he publicly confronted the disciples just 2 days ago for how they were treating this woman, in this setting, he doesn't out Judas. He gives enough of a cover, enough ambiguity that only Judas knows who Jesus is talking to. And it's almost like Jesus is saying to him, I'm not going to stop you, but I am going to try to get you to think one more time before you finish this. Because the actual word when Jesus says, one of you will betray me, even though you could make the argument Judas has already betrayed him, he's already gone to the priest, it's actually, you're going to betray me in the future is the language there. So even though he has taken some steps, he hasn't got to the final step yet, and Jesus has given him chances to slow down. But I'm not going to stop you, but I'm going to slow you down. And it's reminded that God honors our freedom so much that he won't interfere with it. And it's the part of God that we don't understand. It's the part when we say, why doesn't God do something about that? And we're reminded again that God values freedom. He wants people to respond to him out of responding to him out of love and about who he is, not out of fear, not out of force. And it's a reminder again how different God is from us. He's given the power. We'd like to use it to make sure people do everything that's right and good. And he does that even if it means undermine our own success and our own happiness. Back to John, he says, after Jesus says this, after he says to go do it quickly, no one at the table understood why Jesus said this to Judas. What you're thinking to yourself, these guys have to be the dumbest group of guys I've ever seen, right? I mean, because we're looking at it again, back for 2,000 years. We know the whole story. We're looking for the details. I mean, how many of you ever watch movies and someplace along the way you're trying to figure out who the bad guy is or what's going to happen? Anybody else out there do that? We kind of have this running thing in our family, you know. Who can get it quick, and then we have the follow-up. I could write these things because I could. Because you can figure this stuff out, right? But there's this piece we're always looking for stuff. But in that moment, in the words that Jesus said, he's given enough cover for Judas, which again reminds me how overwhelming and never-ending, how reckless the love of God is. That he doesn't out Judas, he gives him a chance. He tries to slow him down. He's not going to stop him, but he's going to give them chances to stop himself, to choose that different course. And John says Judas took the piece of bread Jesus gave him, and immediately he went out. And that was kind of the last part of the story for Judas. He said, now I'll set Jesus up. He'll finish that whole step. But it was that point of no return, and he makes that step out. And even then, the rest of the guys aren't clear. But here's the thing I want to say before we remind ourselves and participate here. There's going to come a moment when you will feel like chucking it all. That in your faith journey, you're going to feel so frustrated. You may feel so hurt. You may feel so confused or conflicted. Some of you may be first time back at church today because that's been your experience. But there comes this moment, right, that you wonder why God didn't do what he should have done. Or why God did that when you thought he should have done this. There comes these moments for all of us. We just feel like pushing it away and walking away from it. And it's in those moments we have to make that crucial and critical decision of, do I follow that pull and leave, or do I stay? Do I stay or do I go? And here's the thing, in that moment I want you to remember simply this, that there's a lot of hope in Jesus. And the reason there's a lot of hope in Jesus is not because Jesus makes it all better and fixes it all. There's a lot of hope in Jesus because Jesus loves you more than you can imagine. That reckless love that we sang about is so real and so true. That he will continue to chase you down. There's nothing that will prevent him from trying to woo you, but not to grab you and drag you, but to woo you. To get you to use your freedom to make a freeing decision. And here's the thing I want you to know as we wrap this up. Wherever you're at today, you are not too far, and you are not too late. Because the fact of whether you're just listening to this or you're in this space means you are not too far, because I can reach out and throw something at you. Couldn't hit you because you are too far for that. But right up to the end, there's this appeal that seems to keep working, that Jesus keeps calling out to Judas, keep giving him a chance to stop and to turn around, to stop and to turn around. And while following Jesus doesn't always feel good or make sense, because it doesn't. There are times that we are called as his followers to do stuff that just doesn't feel good. Stuff that doesn't always make sense. But you don't have to understand everything to believe in something. The guys in that space that night did not understand everything. I mean, we look at that story, right? They clearly didn't understand everything. They couldn't even figure out which of them was the one betraying Jesus when he says, I'm going to give this bread to the guy, and he's it. But aren't there things in your life that you miss all the time? And it's because of how we look at things, how we see things, what we're looking for in that moment. And in this moment today, I hope what you're looking for is a chance to believe something, even if it doesn't all make sense. Because it's a chance for us to take these emblems, these symbols of what Jesus did, that he lived, that he died, that he came back to life, these symbols of his body that died for us, this bread that symbolizes his body, the juice that symbolizes his blood, for us to take them ourselves, to make that free choice, and then to put it into our own body.